Alright, so in this video, we're going to be talking about graphing polar curves. So what happens if we want to graph r as a function of theta? Or, for example, r equals cosine of 2 theta. Okay, like how does that work? Well, the first step here, okay, because it's kind of hard to visualize exactly how this will look on a polar graph unless you actually know what this graph looks like ahead of time. But what I recommend doing is kind of writing this out as if they were Cartesian coordinates, right? Like it was a y and an x, something like that, because that gives you actually a really good idea of what this polar graph is going to look like. Okay, so you need to the kind of the hardest part of just doing this is figuring out what your intervals are going to be on your theta axis. Okay, so you want your intervals to be where r is going to be maximized, minimized, or 0. All right, and for example here, if we plug in 0 here, okay, if we plug in 0 because we should start at 0, then we're going to get cosine of 0 equaling 1. So our first point will be up here. Now, where will cosine of 2 theta equal 0? Well, that's going to be where we have a cosine of pi over 2, so where 2 theta equals pi over 2. And where would that happen? Well, that's going to happen where theta equals pi over 4. So our next point over our next little dash on the theta axis should be pi over 4, because at that point we have our r equaling 0. All right, now about -1, well, that's just going to be put in a pi over 2, right? Because cosine of, well, it'll become just pi, that's -1. All right, and we can just keep going here. So we get 3 pi over 4, which will be 0. Then we get pi, which will be 1. All right, keep going here. We get 5 pi over 4, 3 pi over 2. Extend this axis a little bit longer. 7 pi over 4, and 2 pi. All right, and it's just going to keep looking like this, right? So we're going to keep going. So as you can see, this graph is sinusoidal, right? So now we can transfer this to a polar graph with our polar axis, right? So where are we starting? Well, we're starting at 1, 0, okay, which we can put right over here. All right. Now, as we approach pi over 4, right, we're going to start off with our r not really decreasing too much, and then as we go to pi over 4, it's going to decrease a lot, okay, and it's going to end up at the origin. So we can so that's going to be our pi over 4, 0 point, all right, and we can kind of draw our pi over 4 line, okay, so we kind of know what we can't cross, all right. So like I said, we're not decreasing at too much as our angle gets bigger at first, but then we decrease a lot. All right, so you can kind of see that happening here. Now, as we approach pi over 2, all right, well, now we're in the negatives now, okay, so now we're actually going to be down here, all right, and we're going to end up, when we get to pi over 2, all right, we're going to be at a radius of -1. Okay, our r is going to be -1. So that's going to end up looking more like this. All right, cool. So now we're going to go to 3 pi over 4. All right, and that's just going to look more like this. All right, as we go to pi, well, then we're getting in the positives, we're going to 1. All right, it's going to look like this. And you can kind of just finish off this curve right here. You kind of see what's happening. Okay, this is a 4-leaf row. Oh, and I got to finish there. All right, so there you see your graph of r equals cosine of 2 theta. So nothing too hard here, but if there is something that you're not understanding, it's most likely how I got from 1, 0 to 0, pi over 4 with that first curve here. Okay, now my explanation for that, right? You have to notice what's happening to your curve as you're going from 0 to pi over 4 here, okay? What's happening to r? Well, r starts off not decreasing too much, right? But as it goes to pi over 4, it's decreasing more and more and more. So that's how we ended up with that curve. If you're still having trouble with that whole concept, honestly stare at it for 5 minutes. That's what I did. That's what worked for me. All right, and then I ended up, interpreting it exactly how I just said it. Okay, so that's gonna do it for this video.
So if this video helped you, make sure you leave a like and subscribe by clicking my icon in the top left. You could also view the playlist for parametric and polar and the next video in the series. See you soon.